And in these sessions, we titled it as How to Build a Time Machine, Organizing Temporalities in the Anthropocenes. And our main speaker today is Professor Stephen Brown. Actually, Steve is his profile is very interesting when I read his profile. Actually, he's a professor in health and organizational psychology from the Department of Management, if I get it correct, Steve, from Nottingham Trent University in the UK. Even though Steve is, in the Department of Management, actually he has been interested in all kinds of very vast area of academic inquiries, including many things in humanities, cultural studies, philosophies, and also I think science, bodily study, memory studies, health studies, I think. I read his profile. So today he's going to give a talk more on, I think, the kind of theoretical aspect of what we call the Anthropocenes here in this presentation. And may I also introduce everyone to my colleagues from just across the street. As I mentioned, I'm from humanities, but actually in Chiang Mai, we have another faculty called Faculty of Social Science, Maya Kovskaya. Maya's who will help me as the moderator after Steve's presentation. Maya teaches critical Anthropocenes and multi-species studies, political eco-philosophies and ecological political theory, post-humanist philosophies of science, STS, as well as political, social, and visual cultural theory at the Faculty of Social Science, CMU here. And at the moment, as Maya has just sent me her profile, she's embarking on a joint multi-species project on viral human and elephant entanglements in northern part of Thailand. I have heard Maya is talking about this a little bit, and it would be nice if we can hear later on about this kind of new project that she's involved in the northern part of Thailand as well. Pretty interesting. So without further ado, I'm going to give this space to Steve to present first, and then after that, Maya will take on my role and help lead the discussion afterward.
Well, thanks, Pasu. Thanks for that introduction. That was very kind. I'm delighted to be a part of this series, and thanks in advance to Maya for doing the moderator role. I'm going to share screens in a second. I do apologise. I have a kind of multi-species situation of my own going on. If I ask my cats to leave, they get very upset about it. So,
don't ask them to leave. They're great.
Great. I've got some slides, so I'm going to do share screen. But just before I start, so actually, I'll share screen first, and we'll go from there. Okay, is that working for everyone? Okay, perfect. So this is, I know many talks start with the disclaimer, this is a work in progress, but this really is a work in progress. It's a work that has barely started, I think. It is a collaborative piece of work, although I take all responsibility for its current version. A collaborative piece of work with some colleagues at the University of Leicester. And they are a mixture of people from the business school there and two very renowned geologists, Mark Williams and Jan Zalasevich. Mark and Jan, anyone who I think is interested in Anthropocene issues will have come across their names. They are two members of the Anthropocene working group, which was established in 2009 by the Subcommission of Quaternary Stratigraphy. So it is the geological working group which is formalizing whether the Anthropocene will be recognized as a new epoch in the history of the Earth system. So they are very renowned scientists. Quite why they have agreed to collaborate with some very strange theoretical social scientists, I don't know, but I'm very glad that they are open to this, and this fills me with a lot of joy about the possibilities of these kinds of collaboration. We have published a paper together with a very similar approach, and this piece of work is building on that to a certain extent, using some of the same theoretical resources. Okay, now by way of background then, the Anthropocene Working Group, I believe, has still not yet fed back and officially confirmed, so it is still not confirmed exactly when the epoch of the Anthropocene begins. As many people will know, and as Bruno Latour has written, technically what is required is what is called a golden spike. A golden spike is the presence of something of a material signal that must be found literally in the rocks everywhere. We must be able to find this same material signal at every point around the world. It's literally something you can hit with a hammer. And that material signal is then treated, literally this thing in the rocks is then dated to a particular point. And this is how this division of the history of the Earth system into various periods, various epochs is done. And over the years, there has been a great deal of debate about when this golden spike might be. And a lot of the diagrams, this is a diagram of Jan's, a lot of the diagrams that we see around changes in things like carbon dioxide levels, in changes in nitrates, all of them give us quite a startling picture that indicates where that golden spike is likely to be. So on the bottom here, we have going back 20,000 years from the modern period. And this is technically then divided into the Holocene, early, mid, and late. And this sort of period is when the sort of major recent events in human civilization have occurred. You know, things like the transition to agrarian settlement, things like the domestication of cattle, things like the invention of viniculture. All of these things happen sort of roughly here within the mid-Holocene. Now you can see, you don't even really need to understand the diagram to see, look, everything is flat. The Holocene, everything is more or less stable. But when we get to the proposed epoch of the Anthropocene, whenever that is, over the past 2,000 years, everything spikes. There's an uptick on everything. And Mark and Jan have endless diagrams like this that show a massive uptick in whatever it is that you want to measure in terms of various aspects of how the Earth system works. So in the past decade, everything goes up. Okay, now the story of this paper then starts in 2019 when the Anthropocene Research Group at Leicester had a conference, and Bruno Latour, the world-renowned social scientist, was very kind to come and give a keynote. I think he came because he wanted to hang out with Mark and Jan, to be honest. But here, as part of the keynote, geologists like to go on field trips. So they like to go and look at rocks and interact with rocks. So we thought, as part of the conference, we should have a field trip. And here you can see Jan on the right. And we took a field trip to Nottingham, which is my home city. And one of the reasons for doing that is the geological sort of composition of Nottingham. Nottingham is built on sandstone. So here you can see sandstone. And this kind of rock is very easy to tunnel through and drill through, which means that during the history of the city, there's been a lot of excavation, a lot of tunneling, which has revealed all of this stratigraphic layering going on. So as part of this field trip, here you can see Jan is explaining to Bruno and to the rest of us. He's guiding us through these various rock layers, which go back then over tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And he was pointing out then the way that you can see these different layerings occurring, and you can tell various histories through looking at these transformations in these layers. So you can literally see time frozen in the layering going on in the sandstone. There is a frozen slice of time which is happening here. Now, like all academic trips, we felt at some point we would probably need lunch and perhaps to go to a bar. So we went to a very famous bar called the Trip to Jerusalem, but on the way, we came across a very mundane piece of urban repair. You can see these people here in their high visibility jackets. So there was a crew who were laying new tarmac on a road. So they were putting a new road surface on. And like any good geologist, Jan couldn't resist then explaining to us something about this tarmac. And he was pointing out, well, we've got tarmac and oil. The oil is most likely from Saudi Arabia. The oil itself is most likely from the Silurian period, which is about 443 million years ago. So that's probably when that oil is from. And what you can see literally is this thing that's 400 million years old being poured onto this sandstone and poured onto this road with all of its layerings. It is though time is being churned up back on itself. Suddenly we are in this moment very close to something ancient. And by looking at this tarmac, this churning up of time back on itself, we have this dynamic process of the Earth time being churned backwards and forwards in this process of the tarmac being laid. But Jan also pointed out, but this is also frozen time. The way that geologists think about pollutants is that a pollutant like oil or plastics lock together molecules in a way where they can't become useful. In other words, they can't enter back into cycles of activity for an enormous period of time. So a piece of plastic is locking up a part of the Earth in a way that's not useful for 10,000 years or so. And similarly, the tarmac being laid is locking up those molecules, freezing them in a way that they can't enter back into living time. So these processes of pollutants, or these processes that we take for granted of human activity, are ways of freezing time and making parts of the Earth no longer useful for considerable periods of time. Things are stuck like this. Now, this is what I want to sort of get to throughout the talk, this freezing of time, this way of organizing that involves freezing and solidifying time in different ways. A little bit of just to situate ourselves in terms of some history. So again, I think many people may know this, but it's always, I think, useful just to go over it. If we look at the history of the idea that we are entering an epoch dominated by human activity. So although the word itself has been around for a while, it's usually attributed to Paul Crutzen in 2000. Obviously, Jan and Mark have been really central to kind of promoting the word, but it's interesting in their work, they talk about a sort of a difference between a geological conception or a stratigraphical conception of the Anthropocene versus social science and humanities and other versions. And what I find very interesting about their work is they're very open to the idea that these different conceptions of the Anthropocene may juxtapose, become woven together in different ways. And again, I think what we're trying to do in this paper is to weave together different ideas around the geological conception of the Anthropocene. But the idea that humans have changed the planet in itself is quite old. We find it in Lucretius, who talks about the way that the world is becoming weary from the mass of humanity which is upon it, which is an idea that Michel Serres, the French philosopher who I'm going to talk about quite extensively, that's an idea that reappears in his work in The Natural Contract, as well as the work he does himself on Lucretius. Buffon talked about the 7 epochs of nature, with the human epoch being the 7th of those. John Tyndall in the 19th century was one of the first to establish that long wave radiation can be absorbed through carbon dioxide and methane, so that change could happen within the climate. Now that idea then that a changes in mixture going on in the climate is a very interesting kind of idea within ideas about the human epoch. A mixture or a change in mixture of gases within the climate is not in itself problematic. Life requires a mixture, and planets that don't have a mixture, that have only one sort of dominant gas, such as carbon dioxide on Mars and Venus, are typically dead planets. So mixture in terms of life is always a good thing. Mixture is something that's interesting. Life depends upon mixture. We can move forward to people like Edouard Leroy, and Leroy, interestingly, the successor of Bergson at the Collège de France, the great philosopher Henri Bergson. It's from Leroy that we get this idea of complex dynamic interactions within the Earth system, and Leroy and then subsequently Vernadsky developed this notion that we move from the geosphere, where there's just interactions in inanimate matter, through to the biosphere, where there are interactions in biological life, and finally to the noosphere, where there is intelligent life is literally doing the reshaping of all of those interactions. And there's links here, I think, to Bergson's notion of creative evolution, that the evolution of life isn't blind, that there are various dynamics and impetus, that life turns back on itself in complex ways as part of its own evolution. And then of course there's, there is Lovelock and Margolis's notion of Gaia. But I just want to focus just for a second on what's often taken to be a sort of crucial moment in that, which is industrialization, or as Dolby calls it, firepower. This sort of shift towards a thermodynamic economy. And that's an interesting kind of topic within Michel Serres' work. So one of Serres' early works, Turner translates Carnot, talks about the way in which we find that sort of shift, not just in industrialization and the organization of human societies, but a literal sort of shift in thinking. What sort of thermodynamics does to how we think, what an aesthetics around thermodynamics does to our perception of the world. And this painting from the great British artist Turner literally has this sort of shift between an old kind of wind-based method of maritime to this new combustion, through this new steam engine version, this new thermodynamic version of sailing. And that idea that the industrialization is the moment of the golden spike, so that when we have the start of industrialization is the moment geologically when we enter the Anthropocene, has always been one candidate. However, I think for Jan and Mark and for the rest of the Anthropocene working group, the golden spike is actually, for them, the nuclear bomb tests in the 1950s. And they argue, geologically, everywhere around the planet, you can literally hit with a hammer a layer in rocks which will have the signal of the increased radiation from those bomb tests in the 1950s. So for them, in the 1950s then is when we entered the Anthropocene. So the bomb tests and the radionuclides from that are the golden spike. Okay. I want now to shift to a then slightly different version of what the Anthropocene might mean, or a different way to think about the Anthropocene. I want to then, I want to start to unpack some of Michel Serres' thinking around this, particularly in his later work from the 2000s onwards. So the problem of the Anthropocene is not just that we are able to reshape the Earth system for Michel Serres, but it's also that our actions in doing so are no longer under our control. So Serres often invokes a very ancient classical European distinction between things that depend upon us and things that do not depend upon us. And Serres argues, well, that no longer holds, because now everything depends upon us. Everything on Earth depends upon human actions, except that we no longer have a choice about the nature of that dependency. It no longer depends upon us, that everything depends upon us. Or as Serres sometimes puts it, we are masters of everything except our own mastery. We have failed to master our own mastery. Now, there's some very interesting sort of geological, very similar ideas. Peter Haff, for example, has an idea of the technosphere. So we've gone from the geosphere to the biosphere to the noosphere, and then Haff argues we've now gone to the technosphere. In the technosphere, nothing is under human control, or nothing is sort of decided any longer by humans, that the kind of technologies and the kind of automated processes that we have set going are now effectively guiding all of our interactions. So Haff argues effectively that the Anthropocene peculiarly then is defined precisely by the lack of human mastery, or by the gradual diminishing of human mastery in the favor of technological processes. Now, something like this is also happening in Serres' work. Serres describes what he calls world objects. A world object, as he defines it, is an artifact that has at least one global scale dimension, be that time, space, speed, or energy. So, for example, a satellite, Serres argues, has a speed that has a global dimension to it, or energy. Or nuclear bombs with regard to energy have at least one global dimension to what they do. Now, in Serres' work, the objects are always kind of rooted in a kind of fetishism. We make objects, but they're also independent from us. We make things which acquire their own existence. This is at the heart of the way that Serres thinks about objects. For him, these world objects are colossal fetishes. We make them, but they have their own transcendental power. So in Haff's sense of the technosphere, the dominance of these kind of world objects, which we have made, but which require their own transcendent powers, again, partly defines what we call the Anthropocene. Now, for Serres, the problem of thinking about geological time, or the problem of thinking about the time of the world system, is that in the humanities and in the social sciences, we're not very good at thinking about the entirety of the history of the Earth system. Many of us thinking kind of problems of 10, 15, 20 years. Maybe we might, if we're sort of historians, think of something, 1,000 years ago. We are not used to thinking about an Earth history that is 4,500 million years old. That kind of timescale doesn't really appear in social scientific and a lot of humanities thinking. But Serres argues we must include the entirety of that history in our thinking if we are to understand our current problems. So we need what he calls the great story. The whole history of the Earth system needs to be a part of our concepts and our theoretical speculation. And one of the reasons Serres says we're not very good at that is what he calls the gardener illusion. So a rose or a flower, imagine if you could think from the position of a rose. The rose thinks that the gardener is immortal because of the differences in their lifespan. Similarly, we humans look at a mountain and we think it has existed forever. But in a geological sense, mountains are a blink in the eye of the Earth system. These things that for us must have existed forever are merely tiny microscopic events with regard to the Earth system. So our inability to escape our own duration. So duration is this version of time we get from Henri Bergson. We can't escape our own lived time, and that makes it very difficult to think about these longer things. So Sarah argues then, well, maybe we need to think like a rose, think like a mountain, or think like part of the Earth system. Now, maybe what would help would be if we had a time machine in some sense. Now, to think of that, to switch to this notion of a time machine, Sarah uses this phrase, a bouquet of time. So bouquet, like a sort of a bunch of flowers, a bouquet of times. It first appears in his book on Lucretius, The Birth of Physics. Lucretius is atomist philosophy, where the world consists of laminar flows of atoms, which suddenly then turbulence appears because of a tiny imperceptible event, the Klineman, that then creates these kind of eddies and whirls within these flows of laminar patterns. So for Lucretius, life is these kind of tiny pockets of turbulence that appear out of these endless streams of atoms. So life is a sort of pocket of semi-stable order that provisionally appears. Now, in Serre's work, then, Serre relates then this to complexity. So it relates Lucretius, who is writing sort of just before the modern period. Serre relates this to more recent things like complexity theory. But we can also see each of those sort of turbulences as tiny entries in the great story. You know, a mountain is a turbulence that happens, that goes on by our standards for a long time, but by the standards of the Earth system, it's in the blink of an eye that it creates that semi-stable pattern of order very briefly. Now, I also want to point out to you the idea of life as a turbulence. It's turning back on itself. It's not really going anywhere. Within time, it is creating this strange swirl that is neither backwards or forwards, but turning back on itself. That swirl is very similar to the spiral which appears within pataphysics, which is going to be the other part of the story that I want to come on to. Okay, I'll come back to that in a second. Now, when Serre thinks about time, he has a really fascinating example of, you know, a good example of a bouquet of time, or a turbulent pattern of semi-stable order that draws things together, would be the motor car. So if you think of a sort of modern motor car, and then you look at the materials that are put together within that motor car, and you look at the history of the various components, we've got things like, you know, the wheel down here, which is an ancient part of human history that still recurs as part of the motor car. We've got the body of the car, which is in effect, Serre says, a bit like an exoskeleton. An exoskeleton is one of the earliest sort of inventions of living beings. So an egg could be thought of as a kind of an exoskeleton. So we have this very old concept within living of an exoskeleton going on. Then we go to things like the rubber on the tires. That goes back to Mesoamerican use of natural latex. We've got the sort of transmission and gears. That goes back to the 18th century and to hydraulics and the development of kind of hydraulic power. Then we've got the internal combustion engine, which is more recent, from the 19th century. Then we've got digital controls, which are very modern, but they date back to difference engines and calculating machines. The car is a combination of different bits of human history and different bits of Earth history combined in one place. The car is a bouquet of times that is held together. It is time and space, things from different places, ideas from different times, held and frozen together. A car is a frozen piece of space-time with regard to human and Earth history. Or it's a vortex, if you like to think of it in that way. So to think of vortexes and these bouquet of times, Sarah often talks about this as percolation. Now, a kind of classic distinction we make when we think about time is time as chronology, you know, what philosophers usually call time A, clock time, versus time as lived experience, the time that Henri Bergson talked about as duration. Now, that's sometimes referred to as time B in certain philosophical accounts. What's interesting in Sayre's thing is this notion of vortexes, this notion of turbulences, bouquet of times, is something sort of in between time A and time B. It is chronologies, but it's chronologies also as part of living time and of being held together in a peculiar way. And Sayre, when he talks about time in this way, talks about time as a kind of a filtering, that time is continuously being filtered, a bit like in this coffee percolator. Time is being percolated. It is being, it passes and it doesn't pass at the same time. In the same way, a turbulence is both time going forwards and turning back on itself. So there is this peculiar then turning around on time, holding it and freezing it within a semi-stable order that is central. Okay. So if the car is one kind of frozen time, the car is in effect a bit like a time machine in the sense that it holds together different times. How might we think about other kinds of time machines that might actually help us address the Anthropocene? How might we think about a different kind of way of holding together time that might be useful for us in thinking about our survival within the Anthropocene? And I want to go to quite an unusual source to think about this. And this is partly inspired by one of our collaborators, Andrew Hugill, is a member of the venerable College of Pataphysics. The College of Pataphysics, which is an incredibly interesting organization, and Andrew is a senior member of the College of Pataphysics. The College of Pataphysics promotes the work of Alfred Jarry, who is a very interesting, legendary figure in French intellectual life. Jarry wrote novels such as The Exploits and Opinions of Dr. Faustroll, Pataphysician. He wrote a number of plays, which are Ubu Roy, for example. These are known as the Ubu cycle. Jarry is an incredibly interesting figure. Jarry, the College of Pataphysics was formed in the 1940s, long after Jarry had died. But the College of Pataphysics itself pushes forward some of Jarry's ideas. Although Andrew is I've met Andrew, so he's an actually living person who's a member of the College of Pataphysics, but there are some members of the College of Pataphysics who are dead. There are some members of the College of Pataphysics who we might say are fictional. For example, the permanent immovable curator of the College of Pataphysics is Dr. Faustroll, the character created by Jarry. Until very recently, until 2014, the vice curator was Her Magnificence Lutembi, which was a crocodile. So the crocodile was sort of second in charge of the College of Pataphysics for a number of years. It's actually impossible to leave the College of Pataphysics because except by being expelled. If you die, you remain a member of the College of Pataphysics, although you are excused from attending meetings. Pataphysics, as Jarry formulated it, he defines it as the science of that which is beyond metaphysics. So pataphysics is to metaphysics as metaphysics is to physics, yeah, if that makes sense. It is a speculative version of metaphysics, or as pataphysicians would see it, the only true science. Pataphysics is the science of the particular, of the laws governing exceptions. You know, things like turbulence, for example, would be an exception. It's the science of imaginary solutions, not things as they are, but as they might be. In pataphysics, all things are equal. There is no hierarchy or final resolution. Pataphysics is imperturbable. It is serious. It is done entirely seriously. All things are pataphysical, but very few people practice pataphysics. In other words, we're all pataphysicians, except some of us know we are pataphysicians. Pataphysics is the ultimate defense against ourselves, because it stops us from, it stops our thinking from being locked and frozen. Now, Jarry wrote a short story, How to Construct a Time Machine, which I've taken as inspiration for this paper. Jarry wrote this in response to the famous novelist H.G. Wells' novel, The Time Machine. Now, in Jarry's problem with that is that in Wells' story, a time machine travels through space as well as time. Now, Jarry had studied under Bergson, and you understood a lot of Bergson's notion of duration. Now, Jarry argued that a true time machine needs to protect us from duration. It needs to isolate us from our own lived time. And the time machine he developed then would be a way of creating a pattern of turbulence that would create an immovable stillness at the heart of duration. So duration would go on around us, but we would pass through duration. So the machine that Jarry developed then, this is a sort of this is an artistic rendition of that. The time machine would have to have absolute rigidity at its heart. And Jarry thought of that in terms of these three gyrostats that rotate upon one another, that create a pattern of turbulence, so that literally the time traveler, the passenger at the heart of it, becomes isolated from duration. Because they are isolated through duration, duration can pass through the person without time stopping and creating their own lived experience. So for Jarry then, extraction from duration, standing outside of duration, could enable us then to be at any point within duration. I've just got a short video that I want to show you by Lawrence Leck illustrating this.
The machine consists of 3 flywheels of the gyrostat fit in the 3 perpendicular plane of Euclidean space, moved by an electric motor hidden in a storage under the seat. The machine has to be perfectly rigid, subject to gravitational action, non-magnetic. The gyrostatic action of the machine makes it transparent to successive space of time. Traveling forwards into the past requires a greater speed to achieve a perfect immobility of duration. Slowing down, one will return to the present from the future. The representation of it is a succession of light projections, the luminiferous ether, which defines the machine duration. Space and present extend reciprocally into 3 dimensions of time: the space that has been covered, past space, the space to come, and the present proper. There are two paths for the machine: the past that occurred before our living present, the real past, and the past created by the machine once it has come back to our present, which is nothing other than the reversibility of the future.
Okay. Let me try and draw some of that together. Why is Jerry's time machine interesting? If we take the idea that a car is a kind of a time machine, that our efforts at organizing that hold together different times, that freeze time in different ways, like the oil and the tarmac turned on one another, if we see a car as a kind of an organized form that acts as a time machine by holding things together in a particular way, what does Jerry's time machine do that's different? Jerry's time machine then seeks to create a relationship to time, not by dominating and freezing time, but by isolating itself to extract it from time. So Jerry's time machine is trying to escape time and become permeable to time, like a form of percolation where everything passes, everything can pass through the time machine, and that's how it operates. So the time machine, when it achieves a particular kind of slowness, then can literally appear to reverse time, because time swirls back around the time machine through its own actions. This is a very different kind of orientation to how we might think about our place within time. Now, we might kind of say both traditional organization like the car, or even sustainable organization with its sort of, use of renewable resources, both of these are still forms of organizing that try to impress themselves upon time. We try to leave a trace upon time. Whereas Jerry argues, we have to disappear within time. We have to we have to free ourselves of the idea that we need to emplace ourselves upon time and space, that we need to dominate. What we need to do is to escape time. Now, in some sense, that means instead of thinking about ordering as pulling together materials, as freezing time in particular artifacts, we have to think about what we might call soft forms of organizing, organizing through codes, techniques, gestures, becoming immobile from within time. Sayre uses the example of geometry, for example. Anyone who does an equation, anyone who looks at a triangle automatically becomes part of the history of ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is with us through geometry. Now, that kind of soft form of organizing, Sayre argues, is what persists. So that's the kind of organizing that we need to drive towards, rather than thinking about our persistence through creating particular material arrangements. We need to organize to form pockets within time rather than freeze and trap time. So where does that leave us? Let me just go to something then very business school sounding then. How might you argue for such a thing when we think about organizing? Well, if we go back to Sayre's notion of a world object, this thing that has at least one global dimension, we might argue that any organization needs and must think in terms of business cycles as long as the greatest dimension of freezing time. So for the oil extracting industries, they must prepare business plans for the next 20,000 years. They need to think of a 20,000 year long business cycle, if that's their orientation to time. So if you don't want a business cycle that long, then you have to not produce objects that have that long amount of frozen time within them. We might think about what you might call fluid versus flexible organizing. Flexible organizing is a sort of established concept within kind of business and management literature, but it usually means flexibility amongst employees, not fluidity in every aspect of the organization, including its leadership. So we need to think of organizing not as the fixing of patterns, but as the capturing of fluid movements within it. We have to kind of free ourselves in terms of thinking about structures of organizing and think instead about mixtures of organizing. Mixtures are very difficult to understand as opposed to structure. We have to ask ourselves, how does a mixture form? How does it persist? Why do we have that form of mixture rather than some other form of mixture? We need perhaps to think about, leadership and the way that management is done, not in terms of kind of structures, but in terms of perhaps the kinds of patterns of organizing we find within swarms, where it's difficult to kind of establish where it is that the kind of direction comes from within a swarm. Now, a lot of organizations are used to thinking about, big data and swarms as part of their markets, not of what they do themselves as having a swarm-like organizational character. And within that, another of Sayre's claims is that everything thinks. Yeah, by thinking, of course, we're talking about a form of thinking not modeled on the kind of notion of kind of human consciousness, but everything thinks in the sense that everything acts and that everything turns around on itself. So the thinking of the things that we engage with needs to be as much a part of the swarm of organizing as the humans involved in it. And Sayre talks a lot about voluntary mutualism. Again, someone like Donna Haraway, of course, is well known, and a lot of thinkers of the Anthropocene have emphasized symbiosis. But I believe, symbiosis is just another word for living together. What we actually need is mutualism, which is this way of living together that confers mutual benefits on one another. Sayre argues maybe we should have voluntary mutualism, or maybe what we need is compulsory mutualism. If you cannot demonstrate that you are operating in a mutualistic form of activity, then there's probably no place for that kind of activity ultimately in a sustainable future. Let me try and, I'm just going to try and draw it together around a couple of last slides then. It's a well-established kind of conceptual point that, the notion of progress is maybe not of much use to us anymore. And I know that Martin Savransky and Craig Lundy have used this phrase after progress. How do we think what comes after progress a lot? And in Sayre's sense, what comes after process is understanding our relationship to the great story, designing time machines that might help us organize our activities that pay attention to our place within the great story. So our theories, concepts and practices need to be informed by this kind of 4,500 million year old kind of history of the Earth system. And in a sense, what comes after process is that nothing's going anywhere. This spiral that the pataphysicians keep coming back to, or the pattern of turbulence, both say the same thing. Things are turning around back on themselves in complex ways. It's not going anywhere. Time continuously percolates, it passes and it doesn't. It speeds and it slows, it turns back on itself. In a sense, the biggest time machine of all is the Earth system itself, which is a gigantic system of creating turbulences, a gigantic system of then creating those pockets of disturbance within the elements continuously. At the same time, another of Sayre's phrases is panbiota. Just as we've managed to socialize every living thing on Earth, so little by little we become indiscernible from those living things. It's no longer up to us that we live with everything else. So we have to find a way then of developing whatever replaces sociality. We have to find ways of living together with everything, even if that includes viruses, and find ways that we have new sets of relations for living. Finally, then, I just wanted to try to connect then with, well, what might all of that have to say about humanism? What might that have to say about versions of humanism? again, Sarah, and I think to some extent, Jerry's notion of a time machine demonstrates to us the sort of coming to the end of a concept of being there, being in place. So Heidegger's notion of Dasein, the idea that we understand our being by being in place, being in a particular place. For Sarah, rather, our being is out of place or outside the there, rather like the traveller in Jerry's time machine who is extracted into nowhere in particular. For Sarah, this is a sort of condition of modern being, that we are everywhere and nowhere. The pan sort of affixes to everything about us, our bodies, our understanding, our communities. So whatever happens to us, the notion of being in place is not especially helpful to us. Sarah also talks a lot about what he calls a cybernetic version of ethics. From the perspective of turbulence, the idea of an established kind of absolute morality doesn't make sense. What is the ethics of a turbulence? What is the ethics of order that turns around on itself? Says the key notion of parasitism that appears in a lot of his work. Well, to be a parasitism is a condition of living. There is no humanity, there is no humanism without parasitism in the first instance. But the parasite is no moral absolute. The parasite is both what makes it possible to live and also what we have to overcome in terms of living. So we have to live with this kind of mixture of good and evil rather than moral absolutes. What runs through all of this, through both Jerry and Sarah, is the idea that our lives are not merely undetermined, but the past itself is undetermined. If you can upend the Silurian and then drop it on a road in Nottingham, it's clear that we don't yet understand the past. The past is alive and geologically alive because we're churning it up continuously. That literally this notion of organizing as a kind of time machine that upends time and space means that history is never over for us. We are only just starting to imagine what history could be for us and how all of those things might come together. Then the final part of this, Sarah argues often that, you know, for a long time, the history of modern science was a shift away from why questions, you know, from formal causes, you know. Science is premised on how, what, why, where questions, you know. Science is premised on forgetting about formal causes and focusing on efficient causes. But for Sarah, there's a kind of renewed then turn back to why questions, you know, the kind of tremendous capacity, the fact that we are amongst all living beings, the fact that we have this kind of control over life itself, even if our mastery of that mastery is escaping us, means that the why question returns. Why bring this future about rather than that future? Why enable these beings to come rather than some other different kinds of beings? And the why question then, perversely, is the question of the Anthropocene, because it's the question of the Earth system. It's always a question of why this rather than that? Why this turbulence rather than that turbulence? Why this mountain in the blip of an eye? Why this species in a blip of an eye rather than some other species? And it's those kind of why questions that for Sarah might give us some kind of sense then of, if not how to master our own mastery, at least to relate to it better. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Steve. Okay, it's a lot in the presentations. Thanks very much. That's quite, in some of the slides are really provoking my kind of understanding of the whole Anthropocenes. So I'm just going to give this role to Maya to just help me kind of lead the discussions and Q&A after these presentations. Maya, would you like to take the mic after me?
Yes, wow, what a very rich and stimulating talk. I hope that there'll be lots and lots of questions coming out of it. It's very philosophically stimulating, and also full of very, very interesting ways to tie together both the empirical, the theoretical, the philosophical, with the very real urgency of the crisis that we are facing. So that was amazing that you could pull all that together in such a short time. There are a couple of things that stood out for me as being particularly fruitful for thinking. I really loved the wonderful illustration of how asphalt on the tarmac literally embodies chunks of frozen time, and it is a way of accessing a kind of history that we're not accustomed to confronting in our own temporal zones or modes of being. And that this is a very interesting provocation for helping us resituate ourselves in the larger sort of planetary picture, and trying to rethink what are we doing, and how should we continue to comport ourselves as a civilization if we want to survive and not destroy the world. So one of the things I noticed was that you gave quite a really wonderful overview for people who weren't familiar with Anthropocene literature of a number of different positions, and pointed out the diversity of approaches from Crutzen all the way up to Stefan and the Great Acceleration folks, and asked the question about whether or not the appropriate golden spike is actually, nuclear, the traces left behind from nuclear power. I was curious about the omission of Maslin and Lewis, 1492 and 1610 from this list. And I know that the interest of time make it impossible to cover all the perspectives, but since this is quite a large position in the Anthropocene sort of nomenclature and also the causal origins debate, I'm curious sort of what your take on their position that the most important golden spikes we find are actually deeply connected with history of colonialism, with indigenous genocide, and of course the building blocks of the plantation powered by slave labor that eventually create the possibility for and the organizational modes that allowed capitalism to emerge as it was. So that's one question I have. And then I want to just bring up a couple other issues I thought were really interesting and important. I loved the way that you talked about having us need to rethink our relationship to this great story, and that the great story cannot only be the history within human timescales, that if we want to understand what we're doing to the earth, to the planet, to the systems that we rely on for life support, then we have to start thinking in these much longer timescales. And I loved that you gave the provocation. Imagine business people were thinking of a 20,000 year business cycle, they would absolutely have to do things in a completely different manner. So I think that this focus that you left us with goes to the core, I think, of what all the really good Anthropocene debates are about, which is really agency. Who's got it or what has it? How does it work? Causality. What are the dominant sort of drivers of this change? We know that lots of things are important, but are there ones that are really much more important than others that we need to focus on in our remediation attempts to live with the planet and think in this other time scale in this great story? And three, most importantly, what of anthropos? So who is this we? Who is the anthropos? How do we conceptualize man, capital M, from the humanist trajectory, or humanity from the humanist trajectory, or some other idea of the human species, let's say, coming out of post-humanist thought? And so maybe in answering the question about Maslin and Lewis, the Columbian Exchange, the Orbis spike as being another contender that connects the geological with the political, the economic, and also the sort of biospheric transformations that were clearly enacted by human activity and continue to unfold today. This question of, is it anthropos, or is it, as Jason Moore likes to say, it's not anthropos, it's not a universal flattened individual, universal flattened actor that is all humankind, but it is very specific modes of activity that very specific historical human beings, mostly white, European, capitalist, colonial powers, have promoted and then spread by force throughout the world. Who is anthropos here? So maybe in thinking about how we rethink our relationship to the great story, I would love to hear your thoughts about agency, causality, and who is this anthropos anyway in the Anthropocene? And how do we think about that in a way that allows us to make that time machine you're talking about, where we can situate ourselves in relation to this great story in a different manner that leads then to different modes of human activity, that leads us to the possibility of imagining ourselves in relation to the world differently, with such consequence that we actually change how we live. Because of course, if we don't, we know what's going to happen, something quite horrible. And then one last little note, I would love it, I think, for a lot of the listeners, I think talking a little bit about the vortex and time turning back on itself. This is fascinating, but it's also really abstract. And I would love it if there's a way you can ground it in an example like you did with asphalt that can help, especially non-native speakers, kind of get a sense of what that means when it's instantiated in actual lived practices, or when it's put in some kind of embodied form in life. What's an example of this vortex of time turning in on itself, and how can we use that to help us rethink the place of anthropos in this great story? And thank you. This has just been fascinating. So those are three sort of areas of questions I'd love to have you, as you wish and as you will, address however you want to, and hopefully just to stimulate the audience out there to throw out some questions as they listen to you answer. I want to hear from all my students. Thank you.
Oh no, thank you, Maya. I mean, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for all those comments. And yeah, I really, yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. I really like the turn you're making to bring this back to let's think not about anthropos as everyone, but about prioritized, within that, and I think the kind of whole bringing it back to the history of colonialism, to the history of imperial violence, and to the, appalling atrocities visited on indigenous peoples under the name of capital, I think is absolutely, and that's absolutely a part of all of this story as well. And I think you're quite right. I've stuck at a level of abstraction because I'm trying to, with my colleagues, I'm trying to push at thinking about how to move between geology and social science and humanities.
Wonderful.
That I think, I mean, and it's incredibly important not to forget, I think, entirely about those kind of aspects, that the Anthropocene is a product of imperialism and colonialism and capital as much as anything else. If I could just try and sort of pick at those, and I'll just do it quickly because I know I went slightly long in the talk. With regard to the different versions, the idea of the golden spike might be in 1492 rather than in 1950. I guess what I'm trying to stick with is I'm trying to work from Jan and Mark's geological conception of the Anthropocene rather than sort of upending that and sort of riffing around that. But I think interestingly in their thinking, they're completely amenable to the idea, well, there could be a historical version of the Anthropocene that identifies a sort of, as they would say, a metaphorical golden spike, or it has a different starting point. But I mean, they're interested in material signals in the earth. And that's the one
I asked about Maslin and Lewis, because the Orbis spikes because of CO2 that's pulled out of the atmosphere when about 90% of the indigenous population is decimated in years. So 1610 was one of the key factors setting off the Little Ice Age, and does actually meet all of the golden spike criteria. but I don't know why that you may be able to speak for these guys better. I'm not sure why there's been resistance to adopting that, because it actually does meet the stratigraphic criteria.
Yeah. And I'm aware that's precisely the sort of some of the stumbling blocks that they've hit in the Anthropocene working group, you know, and I have nowhere near enough expertise to kind of sort out the kind of debates that they have around that. But yeah, I think, again, you know, I think in Sarah's work, I mean, certainly, you know, the history of industrialization, again, you know, again meets many of the criteria that one could look at, you know, various sort of changes in carbon deposits, and that's in with a good shout. I think what's interesting is maybe holding together those different versions, and that's where what for me, you know, is really interesting, and to sort of then slide from that into the bit about the great story stuff. I mean, and what I find really interesting, Sayre says thing, you know, because in Sayre's work, he's always looking at things that are very old or very remote and that don't really fit together. But his argument is that, you know, if we want to understand the technosphere, for example, I mean, we want to, as many philosophers have tried to understand, you know, the essence of technicity or technology. Sayre's version of that is, well, you have to understand technology is exo-Darwinism. You know, the first tools are extension, you know, the club is an extension of the human arm. And that's sort of where it comes from. We externalize our functions within technology in different ways. So understanding that sort of, you know, understanding how, you know, how biological life comes to using shells in eggs, for example, you know, that's as relevant as understanding the sort of runaway production of technology at the minute. So Sayre wants to kind of say everything is already anticipated in the Earth story. Everything we think is new about us is already there and anticipated within the great story. And that's why we need to continuously kind of turn around on it. Just and then with the other couple about the sort of we, I mean, yeah, I don't really have a lot to add to your fantastic kind of description of that. And I think, you know, our humanity and what our humanity means is always a problem for us, but often it's very select groups of people who've had who grant themselves the capacity to ask that question. And maybe it's a sort of democratization of that question. The question of who we are as humanity is a question for all of us. And it's a question that is necessarily very different depending on our histories and how we're located with regards to that. But I think for Sayre, it's about finding ways of collectivity in asking that question that embraces that kind of uniqueness of our different locations with regard to the question of what constitutes humanity. That's interesting. And of course, he wants to involve non-humans in the question of what humanity is, you know, crucially and importantly. And the last one, just with the vortex, I guess to go back to, you know, the idea of sort of soft organizing, that for Sayre, the soft is what persists, you know, code is what persists. I guess when you know, classically, when we think of organization, we think about, you know, durability, building things out of stuff that lasts. Whereas for Sayre, it's these kind of cultural inventions are what lasts, you know, like certain versions of religion last, myth persists and lasts in a way that the civilizations who gave birth to those myths don't. So for Sayre, it's the soft that persists. Geometry, for example, you know, persists long after Hellenic civilization has died. So in a sense, it's moving our thinking about organization to soft forms of organizing, about the projection through code and techniques into, you know, rather than thinking about it in this sort of tarmac way, build more roads and your civilization will last. Now, well, that will die, you know, but what might be with a chance of surviving is a gesture, a code, an idea, or you know, or a way of working things through, like geometry. Those are the things that kind of persist, and we need to sort of shift more towards, if we're in the business of thinking about the persistence of what constitutes us as humans, it's those soft forms of organizing that will last.
Absolutely. I bet there's a bunch of questions out there, and I know people are shy to ask them. So one option is to speak them out, and the other option is to type them in the, and I can read out the question if somebody.
Actually, there are some questions in the chat box already.
That's awesome. Okay, let's see. Oh, wow. Yes. Okay.
Start with the one from Arya.
Okay. Yes. Arya, do you want to read your question out to the group, or do you want me to read it for you?
You can read it to the group. My connection is quite poor here. Yeah.
Okay. So
Thank you.
in geography, and she asks whether or not there is a similarity between Sarah's bouquet of time and Steiner's idea of the vortex and chaos explained in biodynamic agriculture.
I think I might have a quick answer to that, which is that I don't know enough to be able to make that, to be able to make that. I mean, if I could speak a bit more, you know, I suspect they are all rooted in similar kinds of thinking, because a lot of our thinking about turbulence and vortex does, you know, find itself already prefigured in things like Lucretius. You know, the problem in all of that is that, you know, in a sense, absolute order and absolute disorder are equivalents in informational terms, you know. So in Lucretius, these streams of atoms are of the same value as absolute chaos. What's important is the sort of, you know, the thing that cuts between those things, this sort of the way in which, you know, absolute order turns around on itself and becomes something else. Or within absolute disorder, we have a kind of crystalline type structure that starts to turn around on itself and then becomes, you know, a vortex or a turbulence. So I suspect what's in common between both of those things is trying to understand semi-stable order in between, you know, classically in the Prigogine and Stenger's sense, you know, what lies between order and chaos. And that's an ancient problem that Sarah points out, but it's also our problem of how to understand, you know, how to find ways of kind of getting out from under formal organization that aren't collapsing into what for Sarah is noise, you know, this absolute disorder.
Yeah. I think we have a question. Peter, you can probably say your question yourself, right? Are you there?
I think Peter has left.
Well, I can mention his question then.
Yeah.
I think a lot of other people might have the same question. Just to say a little bit more about the mechanics of Jerry's very mechanical time-stopping machine, and again, relating it to the idea of this time turning in on itself. Sort of, what does that really mean?
I mean, Jerry's a really interesting character, and you know, hey, you know, for me, sort of learning about Jerry's ideas from Andrew and talking a lot with Andrew is very dense knowledge of pataphysics. I'd sort of heard of it, but I didn't really kind of properly understood it. And, you know, maybe read a bit about it in Baudrillard. There's an very old chapter by Deleuze called Jerry as a precursor to Heidegger or something like this, you know, Jerry's work is really interesting, and one of the big things around pataphysics is it just a joke? You know, is it? You know, can you build a time? You know, is that a joke? Pataphysicians would say they are deadly serious, you know, but they're also very humorous. But they're deadly serious about their humor, and you know, that's one of the sort of things about Jerry. Is this serious or not? But that's at the heart of pataphysics. That, you know, it's the science of imaginary solutions. It's the science not of things as they are, but as they could be. It's what stands beyond the metaphysical. The metaphysics is an attempt to produce an account of being as we understand it. Pataphysics is an account of the multitude of beings as they might potentially exist. You know, that's why for pataphysics everything is equal, because everything, you know, we must ask, why are there not all these other things? Why are there not these versions of life and humanity and the earth? And pataphysics is interested in all of those things. And interestingly, I think Andrew would point out, there are examples where in the history of computation, for example, in the history of oceanography, where pataphysical ideas prefigured and influenced, you know, the actual development of technologies. So it was that sort of thinking the infinite, thinking the possible as a way to then, you know, as a way to then produce actual kind of solutions. Now, the time machine is, you can actually read, it's a very short text. You can Google it and read how to construct a time machine. And what's really interesting about it is Jerry studied under Bergson. He knew a lot about Bergson's notion of duration. Pataphysics has a very peculiar conception of time and space anyway, in terms of multiple dimensions. But what I really like about it, I mean, without sort of thinking about the mechanics of could you actually do that with a bunch of gyroscopes, but, you know, but what's interesting is that conceptual move of thinking, you know, something like H.G. Wells's time machine is a technology that can dominate time. A technology, you know, it's of a piece with all the problems we have in the Anthropocene. How can we master time and space? And Jerry says that's the wrong way round to think about it. We don't need to master time and space. We need to insulate, isolate ourselves. We need to disappear from time and space, make ourselves small instead of making ourselves big. And if we make ourselves still enough, time will pass through us, because we will become like ether. We will have no living time. You know, the time machine is a way of stopping the duration of the living being. And if the living being has no duration in kind of Bergsonian terms, then we can infinitely mobile. You know, duration can pass around us infinitely because we have no duration of our own. Now, you know, that's really interesting. You know, that kind of, like, you know, I mean, that's the kind of classic piece of sort of pataphysical upending the problem. And, you know, what makes someone like Jerry extraordinary is he's not content with just upending the problem. He'll draw you a diagram, you know, of how to do it as well, you know, irrespective of whether or not it actually works. And I think that's what's really interesting about all of that, you know, and I suppose that is the connection to humanism as well, you know. It's not about sort of enforcing and leaving the trace of humanity on the world. We've already done that, you know, and that hasn't worked out so well with us. It might be better of thinking about how we can disappear into the great story, how we can disappear and become part of that great story rather than just this momentary entry within it.
Mm.
You know, that's actually a really wonderful way to connect those two. Thank you. I want to, just for everybody listening, really stress again, I think for me, one of the big take-home points of this is this question about if we are rethinking anthropos, rethinking the human in the context of this great story that precedes us by millions and millions and millions of years, billions of years. And if one of the trademark qualities that has characteristically defined the human, at least since the Enlightenment's vision of the human, as inscribing our will upon the world, leaving our mark, leaving our trace. Nationalism is filled with this language. You know, our arts, I mean, almost every dimension of our lives is filled with this idea that we should take up space, that we should leave a mark. You know, I don't want to die without having left my mark. And I love this provocation that says, actually, well, we've already left our mark and it hasn't turned out well. We need to back up and say, maybe we need a new way of being with the world that doesn't involve this sort of what Timothy Morton calls a hyper subject that goes along with creating these hyper objects that are so vastly bigger than anything we can even conceive of because they are so widely distributed in time and space. And Timothy Morton has just come out with a brand new book about this specific thing, about the hypo subject as an antidote. What we need now is this turn. And it really connects with what you've just said, that we need to learn how to not just reduce our footprint, but to learn how to move through the world in ways that don't wreck everything that we touch. And I loved, maybe you could say another word if we don't have another question. Or if we do, we'll take the question. But I loved the example of thinking with the world. And I love the example of swarms. I was thinking of murmurations of starlings, highly coordinated, and yet they're acephalous organizational patterns. There's no actual individual leader. There's no ego driving it. There's a kind of attunement process, like maybe Goffman talked about. Very careful, learning to attune ourselves to not just other humans, but to the myriad forms of being in the world, living and animate and inanimate, that we have to live with if we're going to preserve a world that is habitable. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about thinking with the world and what's entailed in that, or if we just, oh, we have a question. Maybe.
Can I just jump in real quick, Maya? Because I was having the question about these last bits of Steve, and he was talking about the idea of, being outside of the world and comparing, with reference to Heideggers and everything. And also, I was reading Chiang questions, and I think it's quite related. I think Steve and Maya has already answered to some of the extent. If we're not trying to be in the world, then it wouldn't be, coming back to the idea of, human-centric, but you just talk about, Timothy Morton's work, which is another different perspective of, being with the earth, actually. So I think that's already questions. And I think there are other questions. Yeah, on the bottoms. Levine, am I pronouncing your name correct? Levine Ahmed. How would you relate the concept of deep time? And this is very interesting. The deep time and the problem of scale with your discussion of time machine. Would you want to elaborate a little bit on that, Steve? Maybe just another terminologies or.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, I mean, the key distinction, I think, in Jarry and also to some extent in Serre is how do you get away from, if we have a notion of chronology, however large, we could, and geologists divide the earth up into these different epochs and periods, and we can think back quite a long way in those, but that's slightly in tension with duration and kind of lived time. And lots of our problems with thinking that other big version of time come because we don't really understand lived time as a concept, because we're sort of stuck in our own durations. We measure the world around us by the sort of scale of our own lifetimes and by the sort of speed of our own living, and the kind of way that, so we've got, there's two sets of problems. How do you think about very old stuff, but how do you sort of think outside of your own timing of your own life? And I think what Serre is trying to do precisely is work across those two problems. And the idea of time as percolatory or time as turbulence, or he sometimes talks about time because it's convenient in French to think about time as the weather, le temps, which means both time and the weather. These things, Serre is continuously trying to help us move between sort of a humanized version of time and an Earth system version of time. And I think that's the really interesting kind of space in between those two times rather than one versus the other.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, we have a couple other questions. Yay, you guys for coming through. Okay, can I take actually Maya's before Aria's, because Aria already asked a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so Maya Dania, who is a lecturer at Maple University and is a PhD student in the social science department with me, she says, thank you for elaborating several key concepts about how to perceive time in the Anthropocene. And she would like it if you could talk a little more about time, memory in relation to vulnerability, which she believes is equally important to sustainability. And vulnerability can be, I guess, in reference to a whole number of different things, whether it's, individual people or certain groups of people or non-human life forms or the systems of the planet themselves. But should we be also thinking about vulnerability alongside this question of sustainability, which of course means, can we keep doing what we're doing and get away with it as long as possible?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got a satisfactory answer to that, but I'll try a couple of things. First of all, I'm sure everyone's sort of familiar with the discourse of resilience. We hear a lot about this in the pandemic, resilience. You know, I was trained as a psychologist. I'm sick of resilience as a concept. You know, it just sort of throws it back on to people to get on with it. You know, and I would far rather talk about our sort of collective openness, or a collective capacity to feel, or our collective capacity to be moved around by others and by the world. And, you know, if that's a sort of version of vulnerability, you know, at that openness rather than the exoskeleton, you know, the attempt to kind of strengthen ourselves in order that we can kind of keep going, I would far rather explore how it is we can feel what we're doing, you know, to the Earth system, how we can feel what we're doing to others, how we can feel those relations we have with a variety of other sort of species, you know. So yeah, there is something in both sustainability, I think, and resilience that I think is problematic as a concept, as opposed to vulnerability.
Yeah. Okay, and we have another question. Oh, let me see. Where did that go?
And that's from Maria again.
And how about design, the idea of designing cities or products that are biodegradable? How does this relate? Is this a step towards the time machine, or how should it be something more like an ideal?
My colleague Mark Williams sometimes has a marvelous slide that he shows, which is imagining a city sort of 10,000, imagining a human city 10,000 years in the future, when it's probably going to be under the soil. And he's sort of, you know, imagine, try and do an experiment if you can. Imagine human cities 100,000 years in the future. Imagine some other life form digging into the rock, like we dig into the Silurian and upend it. You know, what kind of stuff are they going to churn up? They're going to churn up a lot of terrible stuff. They're going to churn up a lot of mercury. They're going to churn up a lot of kind of highly radioactive stuff. They're going to churn up a lot of stuff that's just frozen and dead because we lock those molecules in a way that's not going to be unlockable for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So kind of future, you know, the archaeology of future human cities is going to be a pretty grim business, you know. Even if we make them biodegradable, you know, with the current scale that they are, it is still going to be a very interesting kind of stratigraphic layer that's going to be on the Earth that has already mixed and combined things up in different ways. Now, of course, at one level, sort of biodegradability and sustainability of cities, of course, it's got to be a good thing. What else can we do other than do more things like this? But seen from the perspective of the great story and of the Earth system, you know, it is sort of tinkering with what is already an interestingly stratigraphic mess. And if you like, the upending 100,000 years in the future of the human cities it will be a time machine in and of itself. You know, it will be an act of a time machine that will produce something incredibly complex, and certainly something that no human could survive.
I just realized that I accidentally skipped over a really great question that Chiang asked, and maybe we can end with that, or are we okay to keep going with one more question?
I think we can take one more question after Trang. Yeah.
This is a really wonderful, thoughtful provocation as well. So Trang says, thanks for the interesting talk. I just wonder whether the idea of isolating ourselves from time and being out of place is rather anthropocentric as well, as it sees humans as at once again standing over and above the Earth, looking in and unrelated to other beings. Are non-humans isolating themselves from time and place too? Are they also out of place? I think this is a fantastic, difficult question.
That's a great question, isn't it? I'm not even sure I can muster an answer that has the kind of craft and beauty of the question. I mean, let me just try a couple of things. I mean, I don't see isolating ourselves from time needs to be thought of as like a God trick. I don't think it is about standing over it. I think it's disappearing into time. You know, in the way that kind of ash released into the wind is sort of disappearing into the wind. So I think it's disappearing into time rather than sort of finding a sort of externalized position out of time. And I think, again, that's the difference between H.G. Wells' time machine and Jarry's time machine. You know, H.G. Wells, Victorian colonialist, you know, wants to be in all places and sort of, you know, and wants to disappear and reappear in all these different places, whereas Jarry wants to sort of disappear and almost, you know, become impermeable such that it can just pass through duration. So I think it's something like that. As to whether other non-humans are doing it, I mean, I guess, you know, this is a crude example, but, you know, isn't a virus something that's sort of disappearing from time in terms of its infinite mutations and infinite reoccurrences in different patterns? Isn't that a kind of way of living that kind of is doing that sort of disappearing trick to be outside of kind of duration? I mean, Sarah argues, you know, all life is parasitic, humans are parasites, but everything's parasitic. But smaller, more nimbler parasites out-parasitize the bigger parasites. And if you like, a sort of strategy for living is to live like a virus, is to kind of disappear, you know, and to not, you know, because the minute you occupy a position, then your position will be taken. You know, the minute you clean your garden, the little rabbits and other mammals come in and they eat your vegetables. You know, the problem is you have to find a different way to live with those other mammals, you know, and creating blockades and barriers and fences doesn't work, you know. So yeah, so I think that's really nice. I really like that idea, but I think there might be some mileage in thinking about other kinds of non-humans and their ways of living as, you know, aspirational for the ways that we might want to live.
Can I take one more? No, not can I, but we can take one more question from the people in the room, if there's any, before we end the sessions. Anyone like to reflect? Okay, I think we have 20. Okay. Nope. Okay.
I would like to just add one thought.
Sure.
Loved also, one of the things that really sticks with me from your talk was that we need to find ways of living with everything, which includes the great story of the past and the future as well, to truly find ways of living with all that there is. And I think one possible avenue of teaching about how to live with everything, there are two thoughts I have. One is that looking at how ecosystems actually work is one way we can learn how to disappear, not only into time, but into ecosystems space as well, to retract from our artificial externality and come back into the biosphere as actual biospheric members. And for longer than any other cause that we have access to. And they have never forgotten that we have to live with everything. So maybe that's another place to try to learn how to retool our own thinking about how we take up time and space in this world that we're making with all these myriad other forms of beings. Anyway, I want to just say thank you for such stimulating food for thought. I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time, and I hope these dialogues can continue. If anybody has questions that they want to ask, they were too shy to ask now, they might send them to me and we can forward them on. But I'd love it if we can keep this conversation going. I think it's very fruitful and very enriching.
I like to just advertise the last episode of the series here, just real quick. So we'll have the last episode, the sessions on the 5th of May, which is titled "The Robot Multiple: Fiction and Technoscience in the Emerging of Robots and AI." So that's going to be shifting toward more of the sci-fi fictions. So if anyone interested in, stay tuned for our next sessions. Okay. Okay, so today, thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, all the audiences who attend these fantastic presentations. And I agree, Maya, this is going to stick in my mind for a while, all the slides that Steve had just presented. Okay, thank you very much again, and have a good evening and good afternoon if you're from Europe, and have a good day if you're from North America. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Steve. Bye.